Now, Lincoln and his administration has been criticized for not giving enough shrift to the Indians, whether it's in Minnesota or in the territories, all the way down there. But you mentioned in the book that he was kept in the background a bit and not apprised of all the situations that were going on out there. Lincoln, I'm talking about. So, with the Indian policies in the Kansas and Trans-Mississippi area, somewhat independent of Washington, D.C. during this period.
It was, and that wasn't necessarily a good thing, as you indicate. The Lincoln administration of course, has its plate full, more than any other administration in American history before or since. The position that Lincoln takes and what he's telling the Indian leaders that come to Washington is that relationships have been very bad in the past, that Indians were not given any kind of fair play, they were not given a fair shake by the United States government, and he would like to change that. But he's a little busy now. The position he took, unfortunately, encouraged people in the Army, people in the Office of Indian Affairs, the forerunner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which has to have been the most corrupt office in the United States government. It was, you would take a job as an Indian agent, and you would leave it rich. Almost all of them did. The job up until the election of Lincoln was always in the hands of Southern Democrats. The chief Indian agent going into the Civil War is Douglas Cooper, and he goes from being the Indian agent of the United States to the Indian agent of the Confederate States to a Confederate general, and that was pretty much of a pattern. Indian agents control the annuities. Every year, Indians got a payment from the United States government for the lands that they had been forced to leave. The agent was in charge of the distribution of that. There were also licensed traders. Nobody could do business with the Indians unless you had a license from the government. And these were, well, in this period of time, what we're looking at, include people who are generals. Governor of Kansas, at one point, owns the company that has the license with the Indians. And how the annuities work is the Indian agent gets the money from Washington and is supposed to pass it on to the Indians. The agent can basically present a bill to the Indian agent for anything. It's not like he checks it. It's not like the Indians are themselves keeping books on this in most cases. So the Indian agent says they owe me $20,000, and $20,000 comes right off the top to the Indian agent, from the Indian agent to the licensed monopolist. And indeed, these are often people who are even relatives and business partners of people who are serving as Indian agents. It's a remarkable. Fortunately, we've gotten rid of all of that now, right? No problem like that in the oil industry.
So was the motivation for keeping Washington in the dark a conspiracy of agents, Indian agents, and Army to profit, basically? Was it mainly a money issue?
I think that money had a lot to do with it. There's a good argument to make that the way that the system was set up in terms of managing the Indian Territory, that this was going to be what would happen no matter who you put in charge. In 1861, the Lincoln administration actually assigned 3 people, including Augustus Wattles, one of the residents of Utopia, Ohio, who was writing with John Brown before the war, a group of 3 sort of troubleshooters to go west and make recommendations as to what should happen. Their report was filed away somewhere. It's not in the official records of the War of the Rebellion. It's not in the archives that I've been able to find. It might be in there somewhere. But their recommendation surely was for major radical change. Wattles, for example, favored joint citizenship between, so that Indians and, say, the Cherokee Nation would be citizens of that nation and would also be citizens of the United States. The argument being that that was the only way that they could actually have control over their destiny was to have a voice in the government of the United States. They had very little role, these sort of new Republican ways of thinking about things in 1861. The old hierarchy, the regular Army officers, the regular generals, the political machines in the Western Territory, the Office of Indian Affairs, and even when the war is going at full scream by 1863, these people are still at work doing their business. And one of the interesting tragedies as an individual in all of this is probably General James Gilpatrick Blunt, who was a Maine doctor who rode with John Brown, who became one of the great cavalry commanders of the Civil War, an incredible Union military leader, was totally corrupted by the entire thing.
Human nature being what it is.
Well, under the right circumstances.
Well,
right,
of course.
But Phillips wasn't, and some of them weren't. The trouble is that when the general commanding is, it becomes very difficult.
To be on the square. I'm going to ask you about this. Let's go to the labor issues in here.
Mm-hmm.
You write about the radical version of the emerging free labor ideology. First of all, if you give us your own definition of radical, you do mention in here, and it's a quote, "What radicals described as radical would be ignored in favor of a definition imposed by non-radicals," unquote. How would you describe radical for your book?
Well, I would, in particular, that quote is about the way people talk about the radical waging of the Civil War. In particular, Richard Hinton, who rode with John Brown, was an ex-Chartist, was later a founder of sections of Marx's First International, dies as one of the founders of the American Socialist Movement. It's in the middle of all of this. He's one of the officers in the Black Regiment in Kansas. And he explicitly says that what's happening is that people are looting when they go south. Jayhawking was the term that they used on the border. And essentially functioning as pirates and describing this as a radical way of conducting the war. And in particular, what he argued, and what Phillips argues, and most of these folks, what John Brown argued, as far as that goes, was that most Southern whites didn't own slaves, and that the political task that they faced was how do you persuade them to break with the secessionists, right? And you obviously aren't going to do that by coming in and burning their farmhouse for no reason and carting off the furniture back to Kansas, right? So this is that distinction between radicalism in terms of the way the war is waged. The free labor ideology, I think that Eric Foner has done a lot in terms of explaining what the free labor idea is. What I've argued in some of my earlier work and in this one is that land reform is an essential component of that. The idea of Jefferson or any of the sort of founders who were more interested in classical republicanism was that the only way that Republican government worked is if people have a relative level of equality.